Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast that works hard towards ascension so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam Simpson. I'm joined by co-host Terry Robinson. And have you ever been frustrated when you had that perfectly, finely crafted role-playing experience? You were ready to unveil it to your amazed players, and then Scourge came and wrecked it at the table. Well, you're going to understand what we're talking about today because we're talking about the Artisans Handbook, 4 Tomes of Magic. But before we do, Terry, are there any announcements?
This is Future Terry, noting that this episode has some drops in audio on my end, and also I still had a cold for it. I recorded it before realizing what was happening. In most cases, I left the gaps in as it just sounded better than cutting them out entirely, which caused, time to seemingly skip forward. I think I have it fixed, and if I don't in the future, I'm just going to re-record it. Also, if you're an executive producer, there's a bonus episode in the Patreon feed of Bryce and I talking convention game ideas. Next week will be our last regular episode of the year, and then we'll be doing episodes every other week, hopefully with some other audio-related things dropped in there. I have a bunch of fiction pieces that I'm looking to get narrated, and a few other things that I'm trying to scrape together the cycles to have. Future Terry out. We have had a bevy of members of the Mage the Podcast community recently come out with delightful bits of community content. We will likely do an episode about that shortly, but if you are interested in a publication on bog mummies, mage corporations, how to use the hollow earth, all of those have come out recently, and I think they're quite keen. We have a friend of the show that did a book on the Dullahan, which are the headless horsemen of various legends. Pukaji of the podcast did a encyclopedic text called Book of Days. So if you're looking, which I would just call the big book of junctures, but if you're like, I want more things done by people who aren't doing this professionally, but obviously like it more than a sane person should, look at our show notes and see some of the stuff that's come out recently. It's pretty great. That's all for me.
All right. Well, the Artisans Handbook came out for Sorcerers Crusade in 1999. It was written by Phil Masters with some contributions from Lindsay Woodcock. It clocks in at 96 pages, and this book is all about the Artificers, those who are, one might be able to say that something akin to the techno-mages of their time. There's the High Guild, the Artificers that we see from the Order of Reason, also the Craftmasons. Those are the two groups that this book really focuses on carefully, but there's also some material for the Celestial Masters, Void Seekers, and some disparates who employ that approach to magic. But Terry, can you give us a walkthrough?
I will be glad to. Normally when I do these walkthroughs, I am reading from an outline, and the outline invariably is Roman numeral 1, front information, Roman numeral 2, prelude, Roman numeral 3, introduction, Roman numeral 4, chapter 1. A weird thing happened in this book, and I'm going to think it was caused by sacred geometry, because based on this book, everything is caused by sacred geometry. And that is the fact Roman numeral 1 in my outline is for chapter 1, because this book just kind of gets into it. We don't have a prelude. The introduction is like, this is what's going to be in this book. Here's a piece of art. What else do you want? Go read. And I was worried that this was not going to be a Mage the Ascension book without those vital pieces to it. But the moment on page 6, I saw 2 people with incredibly pronounced noses and facial features and hands that could break marble with their bare fingertips due to the artistry of Laubenstein. I knew this was going to be a mage book. And then chapter 1 just kind of gets into it with a little piece of opening fiction that runs throughout the entire text, which I will summarize as the subtitle of this book of So You Think You Want to Learn Silvercraft, Punk. We follow the story of apprentice Rosa, who's a little too clever for her own good. And because of her curiosity, she gets to learn magic and silvercraft. We get the idea that machinae are scientific in a way for the period that can be both imaginative and bizarre. And the book kind of just starts outlining what the state of technology is, how study works, and it tells us who's going to be covered in the book. This book is largely going to consist of the Order of Reason, a handful of others, and even within the High Artisans and the Craftmasons, only some some of those groups. It will only lightly touch on the Void Seekers and the Celestial Masters, talks heavily about the division between the high artisans wanting to do wonderful inspired work and the craftsmasons wanting their work to be useful to the common man. Just like any other thing that you would learn during this period of time that is a skill or a trade, there is an apprenticeship process, and it largely uses the same form that mundane crafters use, which improves the master, the convention, and the apprentice. This is supervised by a guild where an apprentice pays a stiff fee to a master with a contract which involves long hours and no pay for 6 or 7 years. Eventually you get promoted to a journeyman and gain independence, which was a bit of an anomaly in the world. You had a skilled person capable of making money that was able to move from town to town. You would work under another master for a guild set rate, and you would try and take advantage of your time with this other master to work on a masterpiece, something that you could produce to prove that you had the skill to kind of set up your own shop with the approval of your guild. You would work hours with another master in exchange for access to a tool bench or maybe raw materials, and try and prove your mettle. The Daedalians have a more complex setup in many cases, which may have extra ranks and names. The Celestial Masters and Void Seekers just mirror those around them, while the Craftmasons have 33 distinct levels and less emphasis on masterpieces as their work is coordinated. They're caring more about your work ethic in a lot of cases. Other groups want to see a true enlightened masterpiece before granting the high title of Resplendent. The next piece is talking about how Rosa gets her first exposure to the Craftmasons. In comparison, she says that they are direct, they share leadership, and they are very action-oriented. We then get a kind of a snapshot about what current technology is, and the key things it focuses on are gunpowder and the printing press are being perfected. Gothic rules of thumb are being replaced by calculated classical forms. The dome is only slowly making its way into the West, even though it's been part of Batini and Arab architecture at this point for quite some time. The longbow is giving way to the cannon. Pole arms are kind of your big battlefield technology. Cannons have the ability to destroy walls and explosives of all type, will spook horses. Steppe armies out of the east are using composite bows, but have gained an appreciation for the cannon to break sieges. This book is kind of about the Order of Reason's love affair, torrid love affair at that, with the cannon, and I am kind of here for it. It goes over boat technology, the Mediterranean trireme, how cannons are requiring people to go from using oars to sails. The Atlantic doesn't oar well. It goes over the other ships that can be found around the world, that the Dhow and the Sambak with lateen sails are what is used to navigate the Indian monsoons. Chinese junks are kind of the maritime wonder of the age, and Zheng He's main ship is this 9-mast, 500-foot, 3,000-ton super ship. Balloons, helicopters, and kites are kind of the limit of aerial vehicles right now. The clock is the most advanced machine kind of out there, and proper mechanical clocks don't quite exist yet, and they are driven by the desire to have prayer schedules. The Chinese clocks are the most powerful and accurate out there, and their astrological equipment is accurate to within about a fraction of a degree. Just about everything is powered by muscle. Chemical power works for very short bursts, and tension exists, and wind can be useful upon water. Math outside of Europe is generally more developed, and artisan members of Persia, India, and China are kind of expected to be kept to a higher mathematical and numerical standard. It uses the example of a device that is passing from extraordinary to mundane use, and that is the wheel lock, basically a sparking circle that is spring-loaded that will allow for a much more reliable and much more rapid activation of the gunpowder-powered handgun or other projectile devices. But clearly the most dangerous device of the age is the printing press, which allows for potent mind magic, as books are a kind of fixed wisdom that people will generally not have issue with. It makes sideways reference to House Verdicious in the Order of Hermes as being mechanomagical, and the Solificati are listed as having a strong mystic bend to them. Hopefully the rest of the book will kind of explain that. So yeah, it starts off with a survey of technology. I thought this chapter was fine, kind of gave us an idea of what was happening, where, when, roughly. What did you think of chapter 1, Adam?
I thought it was very good. The information about the general technology and transportation methods of the time can be useful to storytellers and players, so it was definitely good to see. There's a sidebar on mathematics and crafts where the author challenges the rules of the core book on required skills for artisans. And I thought that was good. I think it's good when a writer gives himself a little bit of creative license and re-examines some things that other people just assume are set in stone. Terry mentioned the wheel lock gun write-up towards the end of the chapter, and I thought that was an excellent example of magic in the process of becoming sleeper technology. Great guidelines and suggested rules for that. And, at times I wish all Mage writers knew Mage as well as this example we see here. So, yeah, Chapter 1 gets a thumbs up from me. I'm ready for Chapter 2.
Chapter 2 is entitled The Great Work, in which Rosa makes a diamond blade, and she uses it to help someone else stab a guy. It now goes over a lot of history. So I am torn on this because longtime fans of the show will know that there is no such thing as a bad timeline in the Terry Robinson continuity of Mage the Ascension. This is nearly a timeline. So this kind of splits the difference between M20's Long List of Vagaries and a good timeline. But it talks about how artificers of the era look to ancient text, while craftsmasons look to ancient buildings, artisans to work to Mesopotamia and controlling rivers, which makes no sense to me because that really sounds like a craftmason thing. But that's just me. They say one of the first principles that the artisans invoked was the idea of as above, so below, and out of that ancient geometry, sacred geometry is born. Apparently, I would have liked a little bit more of an explanation to there. The oldest artisan is considered Imhotep, who built the pyramids. The Daedalians consider Daedalus of Athens to be one of their key figures, with Athena being his demon. Ariadne is his secret apprentice, and Daedalus's lesson is to avoid emotional entanglements more so than to avoid pride. Ariadne, in their story, may have been awakened and may have ascended, or may have been an alcoholic. So I kind of like that ambiguity. They leave something nice to have a meaty topic over which characters can argue. I found it interesting that they say that craftmasons claim Solomon not for the symbols that he used and the seal of Solomon, but for the physical construction of the temple, a physical manifestation of the unity of design.
Just jump in here. A few years back, I got a book on written by real-world craftmasons saying this is the secret history that everybody ought to know, that shouldn't be a history that explains where we came from. And so I was like, okay, fine. So I was reading the beginning of it, and it said, yeah, we craftmasons trace our beginning to Solomon and his temple. He built a mighty fine building, and that's what we're all about. And I thought, wow, I didn't expect that. But yeah, I guess there's some solid connection there.
Yeah, it would be like people who focused on Jesus, but mostly as a carpenter. Everything else is but man, that guy could dovetail. We learn about the delicious idea that there is a character by the name of Andronikos Kiestes who built the Tower of the Winds, which is this ancient building machine for the study of time, and it's full of clocks. And kind of in the same way that you know that you're in an alternate version of the present whenever you see airships in a piece of fiction. In this book, we know that we're dealing with high artisan work the moment time or a bunch of clocks are mentioned kind of in the same sentence. Eastern mages at this time are drawing inspiration from the great work of the Great Wall of China and Kai Lun, who invented paper, Zhang Heng, who built seismographs and powered astronomical instruments. Much of the advance in the West was made possible by contact with Persia and Arabia, who introduced cotton and a number of types of weave, and artificers have picked up a fair amount of knowledge during the Crusades. During the Dark Ages, the conquerors of China entered and saw the Chinese state and institutions and simply chose to become kind of Chinese and integrate themselves into the operations of the state. I don't know if that is true, but it is listed. In 673, Kalanios faces the scourge to create Greek fire, and then we get our first kind of extensive mention of Roger Bacon as being the greatest artificer of the era. He seems to have had an intuitive understanding of scourge before most of his contemporaries, and most artificers consider his more fantastical stories and fantastical creations to be true. It mentions that prior to the Italian Renaissance, the Italian city-states were kind of controlled by a combination of the Hermetics and the vampires, and that they allowed the Renaissance to continue because they had grown fond of nice things, essentially, that they wanted the artistic flourishing to continue, and thus they kind of allowed this movement to go that would ultimately kind of be their undoing. We get a bit on Yoasmi of Brittany, who held the White Tower in southern France. That was the location of kind of the first Order of Reason assault in 1325. A mage that was in the throes of scourge and quiet, who was eventually struck down by hubris. Superstitionists call him a martyr. The Craftmasons who did the attack realized that they could keep going, and thus went on to found the Order of Reason. This was a time when plague was ravaging Europe, so it wasn't a instant triumph, to say the least. Realized the strength of the many, and then they tended to start winning out in large cities, in that the Hermetics still had a kind of a hold over universities and pagan ways in the countryside, with mansions being contested by individual mages. They promoted the construction of cathedrals with subtle mind effects to help foment uprising, but found that with the technology of the era, that peasant revolts were quickly quashed. We get a little bit on what is happening in the current world of the game, which is to say the 15th century. Mortals are largely skeptical of what stone and metal can do. Artisans have the ability to do almost anything on a small scale, but Craftmasons exceed at big, slow stuff. They indicate that Hermeticism and alchemy are fighting enlightenment in universities, and the countryside is overrun with witches, so they tend to recruit in cities. The Ottoman Empire and Italy seem to be their biggest strongholds. They selectively support the arts, and they're taking advantage of the fact that papacy is powerful but generally viewed as scandal-ridden. Lithuania is a battleground between notionally Christian populaces and the pagan and demonic Tezgul the Insane. It talks about how it took quite a bit of work to stop him, that then had to be expunged from history because they didn't want people to know that demons nearly took over Germany. And I'm like, well, that's cool, except for like that demons taking over Germany part, but like we get this pre-runner to the NWO. We get the idea that the Hussite separatist movement may have been implicitly backed by the Order of Reason, as they showed war machines that later catch on across the continent. The fall of Constantinople brings Greek knowledge to the West, and we kind of basic background of what's happening in the rest of the world. We then get a section on kind of basic theories of their magic, and the cornerstone is Ars Preclarus, which is the application of abstract philosophical concepts to the idea that human reason can understand all of creation. It then kind of contrasts this in terms with humanism, which artificers believe in, but with kind of a detached precision. It states that the Order of Reason believes in a kind of universal, at least semi-equality, that most other mages would kind of turn their noses up at, indicating that they are obviously better than their mortal brethren. This part got a little bit kind of confusing to me. It kind of lacked a certain kind of clarity, but it talks keenly about one of the key differences is the Order of Reason, specifically the High Artisans and the Craftmasons, believe that insight can come to anyone through observation, as opposed to being need to pair this observation with something else, which is to say some sort of internal enlightenment. Goes over other organizations that are within the world, who their allies are. We get an outlay of who the High Artisans like. They tend not to directly disdain the Gabrielites or the heathens within their own ranks, and they try and keep them apart. Kind of divide the rest of the Order of Reason into those who are too zealous and those who are too distant, talking about how like the Seekers of the Void and the Celestial Masters are kind of remote, as are the Kosians in a lot of cases, whereas the Gabrielites are seemingly willing to take their fight anywhere. It kind of feels to me like the highway doctrine of anyone going faster than you is a maniac and anyone going slower than you is an idiot. It mentions, one of my favorite lines is regarding how vampires hate fire, and that the High Artisans deal a lot with fire, thus they must be the good guys because vampires hate them. And I'm like, yep, that's my technocracy logic. We then get a bit of information about how they themselves are organized. The Artificers organize themselves kind of in this loose form, as they tend to act as itinerant workers. They often attach themselves to wealthy patrons to be access to power and gain the ability to get resources. They operate lodges, which are described as unusually welcome guild houses. They're often on places of significance where you can have like plot and stuff. Mastery of Prime helps them come up with urban locations that can still have access to a cray, but this is hard. They're sometimes built in strange places that need to be explained, and one of the reasons they attach themselves to patrons is so that the patron can go, Don't worry what's over here. And we get information kind of on who the groups within these conventions are. Adam, who are they?
Well, we have guilds for the Artificers, the Forgers, the Bright Lions, the Pythagorai, and the Mauls. We have guilds for the Craftmasons. The guilds are called the Chalice, the Coin, the Level, the Sword, Hemlock, Chisel, Arrow, Stone, and Scroll. And let's see, we are given very little information on what these particular guilds are like. They are largely left as an exercise for players and storytellers. We are told that the Mauls of the Artificers and the Sword of the Craftmasons are militant guilds. Their members are very good with weapons. They seek direct, violent solutions to problems. We learn that the Hemlock Guild of the Craftmasons is having some trouble recruiting. Every time they throw a get-to-know-us dinner, people kind of veer off. It's like, you're called the Hemlock, and you want me to come to your feast. I'll pass. But other than that, that's really all the detailed information we're given on the guilds. We're told there are 3 general ideological factions within both the Artificers and the Craftmasons. The ideological factions are not so much coherent groups with meetings and leaders, but it's more of a mindset or point of view. The 3 of them are the Sacred Geometrists, the Classicists, and the Materialists. The sacred geometry people are really nuts about their sacred geometry. They're very serious about studying it, applying it, and learning things from it. The classicists look back to ancient Greece and further back for the timeless knowledge that those groups used to know. And also the materialists are going to become very, very popular once the technocracy forms in the 1800s. That, of course, is the people who do not believe in religions and superstitions and want to learn from the material world around them, and those are the only facts you can trust, basically. So that wraps it up for the ideological factions.
I wish contemporary technocracy stuff had that same spectrum. One of the things that I've always found kind of interesting are the pseudo-mysticism that we periodically see within the technocracy, like the cult of the machine within Iteration X, and some of the more bizarre beliefs the syndicate or the progenitors can sometimes have. And I would have liked to see that philosophical difference continued into kind of modern times, but that is a complaint about other books and not this one. We get the barest whiff of information about House Verdish as being viewed as suspicious, as are the more mechanically minded Murshids of the Ali Batin. But again, this chapter very heavily focuses on the High Artisans and the Craftmasons. We get a little bit of information at the end of the chapter that is a future fate that kind of throws forward, and it kind of mixes together the idea that in some books the history of the technocracy is hidden within the technocracy, and in other cases it is well known or people don't care. Kind of the set of philosophical changes that would come in the next 400 or 500 years, again, are a little bit on the vague side, partially because the reformation that happened in the Victorian era is at this point been explained 3 or 4 times and is a little bit on the contradictory side. I was hoping for more information about their basic theories. It's one of those things where it's kind of broken up across 3 different chapters. A lot of the information about the other groups that they work with are kind of vague. Some more specifics would have kind of been nice, but it just kind of talks about it at this high level in-world view that just didn't really have a lot of meat on the bone, but otherwise I thought it was a perfectly fine chapter. Adam, what did you think about chapter 2?
Well, towards the beginning, I really liked the notion of taking Greek and Egyptian historical or pseudo-historical figures and turning them into a kind of shadow history for these 2 conventions of the Order of Reason. And I really like the idea of the parables. Basically, they take these early historical characters and they say, there's a lesson in the life of this figure. Don't make the same mistake that Daedalus made or these other people. And so using that as sort of an ethical moral teaching tool for members of these 2 conventions, I thought was very, very cool, very well done, and there are some names suggested here for use in that in your own games. We get a solid artificer-focused history of the world. It was good, not so much exciting, but good, solid. I'm not going to complain. The quote on page 27 about the difference between the Craftmasons and the Artificers, I thought was beautiful. It says, "It eventually comes to seem that the Masons produce grand schemes but limit immediate change in the world, while artisans can accomplish almost anything they wish, but only on a small scale." I think as a one-statement snapshot of the difference between the two groups so that a storyteller can get an easy handle on it. I think that's very well done. There's a current events section, which is basically giving us some current happenings in the sleeper world of the Renaissance. I guess that's nice, but I'm reaching my saturation point with real-world history in these books. It's like, yeah, that's been very well supplied in the books for Sorcerer's Crusade I read before this one. It's getting to the point where it's not as helpful as it was. Page 30, we get basic theories, and there's sort of a rough explanation of Ars Preclarus, and I really like that. I like the fact that they give us some underpinnings to the belief, but they don't get too detailed with it. I like my paradigm talk to express basic concepts but not get too far into the details, because not only those details but how much they will be implemented, I think, is an exercise for storytellers and players. So I thought that was well done. I enjoyed seeing that. That wraps it up for Chapter 2 for me.
Chapter 3 is entitled Trade Secrets, and this is going to be at least one of our big magic chapters. And it talks about how one of the common views is that Hermetics believe that all things have qualities, and the expression of those qualities determine the properties, that a thing has hotness or coldness or strength kind of baked into it. And Hermetics believe that these things must be experienced, while Artificers believe that they can be merely measured. Hermetics of the time will seek to call down virtues tied to planets into objects or themselves. Sacred geometry is founded on the idea that there are certain relationships in the world that reveal kind of the mind of God or the pattern of creation. If those relationships are repeated, one can manipulate things. So there is a particular correspondence between, say, Mars and Mercury, which indicates the virtue of patience. So if one wishes to create a space that inspires patience, one will mirror the proportions or properties of that relationship in some way, either as a ratio or with geometric elements or something like that. And this was a good start, I would say. We get the idea that different planets and different objects apply to or correspond with different materials and so on. I was hoping sacred geometry would have gone into a lot more detail in terms of giving us examples of what those correspondences are. At this point for the rest of the book, it really felt like sacred geometry was a kind of hand-wavy wand that was used to justify any effect, because it's pretty clear for the rest of it that there is this kind of internal tension between the ordered mysticism of the high artisans and what we would know as science. And the book tries really hard to prevent the D&D phenomenon where your characters are able to build like a steam engine seemingly in middle-age level technical areas simply because they know how to, or your player brought a book to the table. We get information that most builders at this time have some sort of artistic ability, vice versa, in that the line between chemist and artist or painter are not very well defined, that people need to be able to build and kind of determine the quality of the ingredients that are being used in their work, and so on, and vice versa. They mention that spheres aren't really central to the practice, and the crafts are kind of more important. Matter is the cornerstone. It is the most common. Forces is popular, but poorly understood outside of working with light and sound. Prime coerces the universe to admit the creation of new things. Time and entropy are kind of twin spheres, and entropy shows that the earth is sinful and pulled towards decay. Time was once mere prophecy, but it now lets Craftmasons deal with strange fairy magic, and entropy is no longer just being curses. The sphere of connection is embodiment of sacred geometry. Life and mind are problematic but not impossible. They tend to be kind of blunt and pragmatic in the use, and some view the body as yet another machine. Spirit is the hardest of spheres to deal with, as it refuses generally to be measured. The daemon, or the essentially the avatar of a character, is hard to deal with, as in the Christian worldview, souls are unitary compared to other worldviews of the soul. So the idea that there is this other part of you that is not necessarily in agreement with you can be somewhat difficult. They also deal with the fact that they want to have examples, but they want to avoid hero worship, especially among the Craftmasons. So what your avatar will look like will certainly vary around the world. Your forge fire may talk to you. You may have a guardian angel, especially if you are Islamic. Scourge is kind of taken personally, as they believe that if they follow the laws of creation and good craftsmanship, they will be fine. In this era, Scourge will often affect the tool itself and not just the effect. And in some cases, though, Scourge may manifest as a kind of distraction or an impromptu desire to improve a creation or effect. We get a little bit of information about how they deal with the Scourge in forms of purification, including prayer and cleansing, which are the same things rolled out in the core book. And just in case you thought this was not a mage book, page 47 has an aside that tells us that we are wrong for thinking the artisans are just yield iterators. Gee, Adam, why did you think that? Why were you walking into this book with these preconceived notions? I thought that's what they were. Good thing this book just told me I was wrong.
Yeah, I noticed that too. I was reading through. It's like, you think this? Like, no, I don't.
Yep. I both agree and disagree with this sidebar, as I think like the iterators are often more mystical, especially as members of the cult of the machine, and the idea that they will eventually be merged, than high artisans are listed at this time. I also think that they use kind of a too narrow definition of machine in some cases, like buildings and towns and farms are machines that are made of yet smaller machines. We then get a bunch of rotes, and these are fine, and they are almost all of the form of this rote will tell you a thing, or alternatively, this rote will aid your attribute plus ability roll. We get such notable magical effects as detect astrological sign, summon smoke, make your gun fast, here's a lantern that's really good. And we get information, I say this tongue-in-cheek, about the minor spheres of cannon, fire, ghost shooting, arguing, luck, drowning, and tattooing. I was kind of hoping for some slightly more imaginative uses. This book works pretty hard to keep the effects to be somewhat grounded. I was hoping for more information about maybe stranger applications of it. We get a little bit of information about tattoos and prostheses and what medicine would have looked like, and some of the complicated effects that are used to bind spirits and such. This was a start, but to me, to fulfill kind of the promise of a book like this, where it would be able to explain kind of the entire worldview of a high artisan, I would want more information about time and entropy and such, which we just didn't really get that much of. If the goal is to have a difficult worldview that is only partially capable compared to some others, that is kind of the conclusion I drew. But if the goal is to just give us enough information that we can go kind of arbitrarily apply this information towards effects of our own, I needed a little bit more. Again, the information on things like sacred geometry and Ars Preclarus was just kind of a start. I think to run with it really at a table or to have a proper philosophical argument in character, I think we would need a good bit more information. What did you think about Chapter 3?
The section on powers and secrets, I like this idea that only the top leadership of the Order of Reason understands paradigm engineering. Most artisans don't know they are changing the consensus. They believe, like the Hermetics, that they are rediscovering past knowledge. And as a storyteller, that kind of helped me to get a grip on it. I started with Mage in 93 with first edition when every Tom, Dick, and Harry who was awakened was talking about changing the consensus. And so I kind of, approached Mage with that in mind. And so I think it's interesting to look at, the Renaissance era hundreds of years earlier, where the top brass of several groups of mages were starting to understand this, but a lot of the membership weren't quite there yet. And so the early part of Chapter 3 helped me to kind of get a good grip on that. And I think it works for my game, so I'm pleased with that. Pages 39 through 41 give us some good general paradigm information for Renaissance thinking and how that might be applied to players doing their own rotes and approaching their own kinds of projects. So that was nice to see. There's a section on the spheres. It says the artisans don't understand prime well because Renaissance thinking is limited. And I think this gives too little credit to mages. Mages have their own lore, and they do use the spheres, which of course is completely hidden from sleepers. So saying that Renaissance thinking was like this, therefore all mages are limited in this way, it just does not work for me. The idea that a Craftmason's daemon, their avatar, could be a famous building, I think is tremendously fun. I can just imagine a scene where the Parthenon, manifests for someone saying, "Listen to me, I will teach you now, I am the great Parthenon," and the mage says, but I don't want to design a building. I want to design a better crossbow. The Parthenon says, shut up. The principles are the same, and you should be more respectful. I'm the Parthenon, for crying out loud. Of course, that was a little too slapstick, but I think a lot of fun can be had with this. A good attention to rule systems in this chapter. After reading a lot of Mage books of this time, there are a lot of Mage authors who are a little fuzzy on the rules, and so they let someone else handle it. And so I've gotten kind of accustomed to reading through chapters talking about things going on in Mage, but not having any rule systems to go with them. And this chapter does a good job of offering some suggestions for rules and how those might be approached. So that was nice to see. I think it was a good job with this chapter. The rotes, as Terry was saying, most of the rotes are quite low level and very coincidental. In a way, I think they're good for artisans, but yeah, I think, as Terry said, the authors are trying to keep this too closely grounded in a real-world approach to things and scenes that don't get too wild and too crazy. And, just as a longtime Mage fan, I like the idea of some Renaissance-era craft mason or artisan taking some castle out in the countryside and building some grand, crazy machine inside the castle that's going to, turn the whole world inside out starting at this point, and then having a story based around that. I mean, we can have some crazy fun here. I don't think we need to keep it so grounded. However, there was a rote for the secret labyrinth that the Craftmasons learn, and this is basically they do a maze-like design or actually construct something like a labyrinth, and then they charge that with their limited knowledge of the spirit sphere so that actual spirits can become trapped in there, and they have to thread their way around the maze, and they're not really sure how to get out. And this is used as a kind of defense system for lodges or crays or other places where craft masons live. And just the way that was written up and the whole idea of trapping a spirit that has to wander around aimlessly, bumping into the walls, I thought that was really cool. I thought it was well done. So ready for Chapter 4.
Chapter 4 is entitled Masters of the Art, a phrase that has never been used in Mage before and will never be used again. In this chapter, Rosa graduates. Congratulations, Rosa. It's been a fun journey to follow you on. We get some information on character templates, and the character templates cover various affiliations such as the High Artisans, the High Artisans, the High Artisans, the Craftmasons, the Craftsmasons, the High Artisans, the High Artisans, the Alibatini, and the Hermetics. So I wish there had been a little bit more of a spread there. Most of these character sheets are no, secondary abilities, they shall be used. The body forger looks at you and goes, charisma and appearance are dump stats, right? I can get by with just a manipulation of 4, and you're like, that's a choice. Seemingly nobody has dots in resources. The clockmaker talks about their fascination with mechanical clocks, even though the escapement has barely been invented. But these are fine. We get some information about masters within the various groups. We get Brunelleschi, who reintroduces perspective into Western art, who woke making the doors for the baptistry of Florence. Adolphus Ghent, the clockwork user and independent ruler based on clockwork machines, who may or may not have died. Maxima Ariadne, who is widely traveled and brings knowledge of the ancients back to the Western world. Leonardo da Vinci, who is secretly, they don't actually tell us what Leonardo da Vinci is, and I'm fine with that. Roland Hoffman, who oversaw the machine guns that killed Tezgul the Insane, and King Sejong, who invented the Hangul language. So, or the, I guess, Hangul script would be the way of putting it. These were both fine. I think my favorite is just kind of the character of Adolphus Ghent, who is this free-range king who is disgusted by aristocratic incompetence and is recruited by the Craftmasons. And I would have liked more kooky stuff like this. The real-world one, historical characters are fine, and if you want your characters to run into Da Vinci or Brunelleschi, okay. I would have liked some information about how to use historical NPCs, since I think that's a kind of a separate ball of wax if you want to use it, but I was expecting a little bit more kind of imagination in this section, and it just didn't arrive. So this was fine. This was the well-prepared hot dog of chapters where you're like, yep, this is here, and I am slightly more full, but I'm looking around for something else to eat. What did you think about this chapter, Adam?
Yeah, I'd have to agree with your assessment there. I read through this chapter, and it's like, okay, sample characters, you all right? fine. This is what I would expect. In some past Mage books, there's been some fun little things tucked into this kind of section of the book. But in this book, it's standard fare. It's like, yeah, these work. They make sense, I guess. All right. The art is quite nice. But, there's nothing fun. There's nothing unexpected. There's nothing that makes me pause and say, that might be fun to run with. No, it's just very, very standard fare.
Chapter 5 is entitled The Craft Supreme and talks about the types of devices that we have. Mundane devices can be used by sleepers. Unusual devices can be made by sleepers once they are instructed. Extraordinary devices require enlightened construction and much work, but sleepers can eventually make them. May still bring down the scourge. It is easier to build than machine and only require high quality, not impossibly high quality materials. Machine require enlightened hands to work. They count as magical treasure as a background, and they require dots and an appropriate skill to even use. They make mention of greater machine, which are more plot devices, and indicate that players should be discouraged from this. I disagree. If you want to do an entire chronicle around building a magical castle or constructing a skyrigger or something like it, go nuts. As I am fond of stating, great devices like this are often unbalancing so much as they are a pivot. If you have your characters build a walking castle, you now have a game about what it's like to have a walking castle, more so than anything else. It brings up the idea that quintessence, when listed for these devices, aren't actually quintessence, but represent some sort of rare or difficult power source. And I very much went back and forth on this. So, for instance, if your clockwork armor is full of springs and gears, there is not actual quintessence in it, so much as quintessence represents the time and difficulty of rewinding all of those gears and armatures and such. And as a fan of Primal Ventures, I have always interpreted things like that as the act of reloading it being the way that the quintessence gets in through some sort of prime effect, either by focused will or by engaging with a Primal Venture or something like that. So the idea that actually prime is kind of weird to me. It also indicates that extraordinary devices can bring down the scourge. These are devices that require enlightened construction, but sleepers can eventually make them. Is not simply the process of figuring out scientific principles, but even scourge can even strike things that are quote-unquote scientifically possible. This suggests that modern scientists, when they innovate, are also potentially dealing with paradox. This is kind of a potential answer to the question of, so what is science in the world of darkness? That I thought was kind of interesting. We get a chapter on rules-ish, kind of expand on the basic creation rules that we get in the core rulebook. Tries to give like a slightly more detailed bit of information about what kind of the state of things are at the period, indicating how fast the fastest things can move. It was weird to me that everything was done in kind of yards per turn, even for long distance travel. Like it felt like miles per hour or kilometers per hour would have been a bit more natural for that, in that like the length of a turn can vary. So it gives a little bit of information about the scientific principles that can be used behind it. It indicates very specifically that matter 2 and 3 cannot be used to make machine, but matter 1 is very useful to check for impurities. I mean, to me, one of the diagnostic things about magic is the ability to use magic to help you do magic. I would kind of be surprised if someone did not use magic to help create the tools to help them do further effects. That is kind of the power of the bootstrapping there. Here it indicates that doing so can cause you to meddle with dangerous resonance. We find out that in general, Daedalian devices are only slightly better. A artificer ship may go a few miles further in a day, and a Daedalian gun may be slightly less likely to break down. I got the sense that it is trying to balance what an artificer can do, and I'm not quite sure what they're balancing it for. A lot of these rules require several days between roles and use, especially as we go through like the capacity and research process. And like, it seemed like the person who wrote this looked at Ars Magica and is like, well, this is a system that cares about how many days have elapsed, so should mine. And we get no kind of analog to that on the superstitionist side, as it were. So I just felt like there was a set of hidden assumptions in here that I was not privy to. This was the chapter to me where the wheels kind of came off, where I was kind of hoping where everything would be brought together and I would get a unified view of how the organization works, and that didn't quite happen. It has a lot of interesting stuff in it. You get frequent mention to Abadante's oil, other alchemical formulae that had been previously introduced, and a smattering of rules, and it just kind of left me wanting more. It certainly could have been worse, but I was kind of hoping, again, that this is where it would kind of bring everything together. It mentions that improvisation is very difficult to do and should kind of be discouraged, and it felt like the author had a very distinct idea of what it was like to be an artisan or a craftmason, and did not kind of share that before going on to write the book. I think some sort of preface or statement of, hey, this is my intent with this section would have been helpful. What did you think about Chapter 5, Adam?
Well, I like how at the beginning of the chapter it gives us 4 grades of inventions. There's the mundane device, the unusual device, the extraordinary device, and then the machinae. And as long as that is not used as like a hard and fast rule, like a Rosetta Stone for understanding all things created by artisans, as long as you don't fall into that trap, then I think it can be helpful, because each of the 4 levels has different rules and different difficulties for, how reliable is this, how easy is this to pull off, how easy is this to keep working. And so I liked that as a gentle approach. If some storyteller were to start saying, we're totally locking this down as the rules of the game, then that would be a bit confining for me. But it's nice to see it there. On page 75, they talk about using wits plus awareness, possibly some other skills or backgrounds, to see how well a newly created device might resist Scourge. I think that's a fun idea. It's like, how clever are you? Let's do a die roll, and your successes are going to determine how reliable this thing is going to be when you try to use it. And so I thought that was nice. A large part of the later part of the chapter was a sort of, I guess, open-ended, you might even say breezy discussion of the author saying, here are my ideas on guidelines, basically rules for things like speed, duration, stopping power, etc. Different qualities of devices that artisans and craftmasons are going to create. I liked this. I thought it was a nice kind of approach, because it says at the beginning, I'm going to put down some ideas for rules here. If you use everything here, I think it's going to be too much, but pick out what you like to add some substance and some predictability to how you approach devices in the game, if you have any characters making them. And so I appreciated that. I think, as Terry mentioned earlier, that some of the rules can be quite limiting in how well a device can be. I think a device created with spheres should at times be clearly superior to mundane devices. And so I'm not... I don't, as a storyteller, I don't have a problem with someone like making a self-powered cart that can go, really fast for a while, but then it breaks down or it runs out of juice and they can't resupply it because of this and because of that. I don't like my devices to be too mundane, but generally speaking, I liked this chapter's approach to it. It's like, look, let's just talk about a general topic. I'll put down my ideas for some rules you might use or might modify, and then let's go to the next general topic. And so this sort of light, easygoing approach I thought was rather nice, and I think it stimulates me as a storyteller to disagree with the ideas in some aspects. But the fact that this chapter got me into this sort of mode of this frame of mind, I think was helpful. So I don't really have a problem with it. But next up is the appendix.
Next up is the appendix, where we get things like mega glue, forgetting sleepy candles, a snake blade that cuts through magic, needles that cut through magic, a helmet that helps bring down towers, hasty armor, and a ridiculous polearm. We get a wide number of notions of what quintessence could be. We get helicopters, we get a clockwork tree, we get a clockwork octopus, we get a clockwork clock, and we get 1-dot stones, because it's super useful to be able to use 1-dot effects. And they're like, gems. Yes. This chapter includes kind of all the things you have to include. I do like the fact that we finally get like buildings where it's like, oh yeah, this is the Daedalian passageways. They allow you to move quickly through areas and ambush intruders and so on. I just like it's always good when you get an enchanted house. We get more information about the state of technology as regards artillery and siege weapons and personal firearms and rifling and so on, and then a little bit of appendix. So this was yet more fine. By the time we've gotten through this section, it's like, oh man, we've gotten almost nothing on the Bettini or the Solificati or House Verdicious or anything like that. It's just one of those things where, like, when you're reading through a book, you're like, oh, this is pretty good, but I'm really running out of pages. How they gonna fill this out? And I think this book is just kind of struck with the fact that it is of finite length. I would have liked more information by the time we get through. I also do like that the appendix contains the appendix and appendix 2, that the appendix has 2 appendices within its appendix. So what did you think about it, Adam?
That was an interesting mix. Get the vaporous candles of Leth, which use life and mind to break down someone's thoughts and cause them to sleep. I gotta say, I think this should be life and mind, not entropy in mind, because using entropy to break down thoughts is entropy 5, and it's getting into pretty sophisticated territory, whereas affecting the, you might say, humors in someone's body to make them sleepy is far easier and far more direct. So a little bit of pedantry there. Us Mage fans are known for it. Weapons like the Serpent Blade and the Purifier's Needles make good use of special metals' ability to interfere with magical energies. And so it was nice to see. I like seeing that kind of thing in this book. I think it's natural for artificers to talk about the inherent qualities of this metal and that stone and to use that for better effects. I think there's some vehicles in here that give some fun possibilities for gaming groups. I think the writers, I should say, were very concerned with vehicles that were too powerful. I think they were a little more concerned than they needed to be. But still, we get some flying devices, some underwater vehicles, things like that. And I think it's nice to suggest a possibility to storytellers that they might not have realized. Like, wait, we can have submarines in the Renaissance? I thought that was a no-no. It's like, no, it's okay. You can do a submarine in the Renaissance. Oh, cool. Let's get under the moat. Yeah, some fun stuff can pop up there. I think those of us who are Sorcerers Crusade fans, we get a little too guided into certain modes of, no, you've got to think Renaissance for running this game. It's like, well, we've got mages in the Renaissance, and they can do crazy stuff even in the Renaissance. So I think the decorative automata was too expensive, too hard. Is basically this whole section saying the really good mages they bring their A game to make these tiny little decorative clockwork animals that are made out of gold, and they have gems, and they don't do anything useful at all. The only reason they make them is to display their amazing skill with magic. It's like, well, okay, I guess it's kind of a fun little bit to bring in, but it's so hard and so expensive that it's like, you gotta wonder, would it actually be that hard? I mean, is it really that tough to work with gold and a few gemstones and to make something move around, as long as it's not, breaking game balance or beating your opponents easily? It's like, it doesn't have to be that expensive. I think they went a little overboard there. Okay, one of my major criticisms of this book was on the building section. They have a section here saying, okay, here's buildings as devices, which of course is a specialty of the Craftmasons, and the book mentions that many times throughout. So by the time I get to the appendix and it says, okay, we're going to tell you about some magic buildings here, I'm like, yes, you have primed the pump. I am all set for this. And it says, okay, we've got some funky passages. They can get people around quickly, or they can confuse one's enemies, and we're done. And I was thinking, no, you should not be done here. We need more than this. You have told us all about the sacred geometry. You have told us all about how Craftmasons do amazing things with buildings. Now you need to show it to us. Show me how they can collect quintessence and move it from point A to point B, which makes them a valuable part of the Order of Reason. Show me how their buildings lets them see things that other Order of Reason mages can't see, or hide things that other Daedalians can't hide, or something like that. Tell me the cool things that they can do with their buildings, instead of just giving me one little idea and then moving on. Yeah, Appendix 2 inside of the appendix does give some useful information on period weapons. I think we've had some good information before this book in Sorcerers Crusade, but it is nice to get a few more details, and it is appropriate for artificers because they are trying to design cannons, they are trying to design better catapults and gliders and so on, and so taking some time to talk about in a little more detail what the current weapons of the time could and could not do it makes sense here, and it's appropriate. After reading this appendix, what really occurred to me is storytellers and players need to agree on rules for determining rain. Back in the Renaissance, people spent more time outside than we do in modern times. The rain is going to seriously mess up people who are trying to use not only guns and cannons, because the guns of that time were much less watertight, and if you interfere with the powder, the gun's not going to fire or it's going to jam messily. But also the bowstrings of the time, when they got wet, you couldn't fire arrows very well with the bow anymore. And so I can see a lot of scenes where the players are saying, okay, now we're going to beat our opponents. Now we're going to show everybody how cool we are. Let's do this. And the storyteller says, it's raining. The player's like, what? Again, you can't do that to us. It's like, well, can he do that to them? We need to agree on rules. What is the probability of rain on this day or in this season for the game? That way the storyteller can roll in the open in front of the players and say, yes, it is raining. The player's like, well, okay, fine, it's raining. Put the bows away. We'll have to think of something else. Yeah, well, I guess that's one interesting example of how Sorcerer's Crusade is different from modern era Mage. In the modern time, the guns and the bows, it's like if it's raining, just go ahead and use them. It just doesn't matter. We're using different materials now, and we're inside so much of the time. But I think it's time to take a look at the book in general. Terry, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, this book had a sense to which feels appropriate for an order of reason, and High Artisan's book of it not quite being a complete work. The editing kind of trails off towards the end. For instance, it goes appendix numeral 1, appendix numeral 2, and then appendix the word 3. There are a few cases where sentences just kind of end or don't have verbs. And that was a little bit weird, especially kind of towards the end of sections. The book did not feel like a complete thought. Again, the information on Ars Preclarus and Sacred Geometry was a little bit limited, and this felt like a book not necessarily about where it gave us enough philosophy that a storyteller could run a character, but enough items that a player could kind of run it. It focuses almost exclusively on the High Artisans and then a smidge of the Craftmasons, like regardless of what it says. I don't think there's a lot of useful information in here on what a Bettini or a Verdicious Mage would do. To me, the cornerstone of that would be information on material correspondences or actual examples of sacred geometry, which we quite simply don't get. It has a hard needle to thread in the form of what's the difference between alchemy and science of the age and the more occult or mystical applications of things. And it just kind of leaves it to the reader to say, well, if we don't do it nowadays, obviously it was the mystical side of things. And it kind of just ignores that. We do get a grab bag of systems to use that kind of point in the direction of what a game should want to do. It also has this idea that occurs throughout Mage, which I find infuriating, where, for instance, it will mention that a particular effect is vulgar if it goes on for too long. And I don't know of us ever getting rules for what it means for an effect to suddenly become paradoxical or vain in the middle of it already having been cast, because the key to it is that it modifies the difficulty of the effect in the first place. And it says, well, you can be underwater for a little bit, but if you're underwater for a while, Scourge may come down. Okay, give me a system for it. So this was a case where the degree of specificity and I think clarity to run into the table is greater than the book provided, where in general, to me, a book should always be slightly more detailed than you think it should be so that you have the ability to ignore things. Now, mind you, there are other people that say, why is this book telling me in such detail how I need to run my darn game? I can do it any way I want, which I like, which I understand as a viewpoint. I am just generally in the give me a little more than I need, and I will ignore what doesn't apply to my game. Otherwise, it is generally well written. It is solid. To me, this is a BB plus book. Looking at the other titles that are coming down the pike and the other ones that were going to be written for Sorcerer's Crusade, it does very much look like this was a direction that the game was going to go. Instead of providing convention and tradition books, we were going to kind of get practice and instrument books. So we have this, we have Witches and Pagans, we have Swashbuckler's Handbook. We were supposed to get a number of books on the intersection of faith and magic, but those never ultimately came out. Wish more than anything that there were manuscripts for those floating around somewhere from the late 90s, but to the best of my knowledge, there aren't. This is just a case where it was a meal that started out well, but it kind of left a little bit of a weird taste in my mouth. It is a good read regardless. I found it enjoyable to go through. I don't feel that a terrible number of words were wasted, but much like if you say your own name 30 times, it seemingly loses all meaning. Sacred geometry, by the time this book was over, I was just like, sacred geometry. And that was my general view of things. What did you think, Adam?
Throughout the book, at the beginning of chapters or sections, we get a little more fiction of Rosa the Apprentice and how she started out as an inexperienced girl and ended up as a respected master. And it was unexpectedly good. I'm just kind of used to reading through the different Mage books. Whenever they hit the ongoing fiction or the fiction at the beginning, I just sort of ignore it because it's like, yeah, they had to have some fiction, and here it is. And the author's saying, I'm ready to launch my novel career. And I'm like, yeah, I'm ready to get to the real Mage book. But this one was good. It was well written. It pulled in concepts for the given chapter or section very well. And by the end, I felt like I was not being treated to the author's amazing fiction skills, but instead I was being treated to like a practical example of how someone goes from an apprentice to a master and the things they experience along the way that might play into your own game. So yeah, unexpectedly good fiction there. This book was very well written. The author brought his A game. I thought, the author left his baggage at the door. I don't know what the author's personal beliefs are, and that's fine. I felt like the author did not waste my time or indulge himself in personally interesting tangents. He just got to the job of writing the book. He did it very well. So thumbs up for that. But as Terry has said, I think this book stuck a little too close to quote-unquote believable effects and real-world history and real-world technology. I think the author was very apprehensive. He wanted to make sure that his readers understood the real-world technology of the time in detail so that they could use that as a springboard to their games. And I think that's not necessarily so important. I mean, as long as you have a sort of rough idea of what technology was there and was not there, I think from there, players and storytellers can proceed to have their own games. I don't think quite a detailed knowledge was necessary, but it was fun to read. I just wish the book had more imaginative and fun kind of touches. This book gave me a better understanding of the Craftmasons. I'm not going to say I totally didn't understand them. I had a rough idea of what the Craftmasons were generally like. And of course, Craftmasons are new for Sorcerers Crusade. They do not exist at all in modern era Mage in any form. The whole group was dismantled in Mage's history. So this book helped me to understand their mindset, their methods, their approach, how they are similar to other Order of Reason Mages, how they differ. So I appreciate that the book was able to do that for me. I think the book needed more in the way of, say, like something like plot hooks in that general sort of story-focused approach. I mean, what are the conventions or the guilds up to? What problems are they trying to solve other than technical challenges? What alliances are they creating with outside groups or other conventions? Just give me some idea of what is some interesting stuff going on at this time rather than the real-world history and the real-world technology. Also, the disparates were really ignored in this book. I mean, I would have liked to have seen some disparate group in Germany, say, that is just annoying to the Artificers. They've decided to stomp on them. Or some lone disparate artificer type on the Italian peninsula who's made some amazing discovery. And so the Artificers in the leadership of the Order of Reason are like, okay, everybody guard this guy, but leave him alone because his next breakthrough could just be amazing. We want to steal it. So it's like they're protecting the guy from all other Mage influence. And, interesting stories can come out of that. Or perhaps there's a group of disparates in North Africa who, because of Muslim history and culture, they've got some amazing technology, and so the Order of Reason is trying to learn it from them, but they're being blocked at every turn. I mean, give us some story ideas, some faction interplay, something like that. This book just had a relentless focus on real-world technology and real-world history, and I think at times the author kind of forgot that, hey, there's some wild and crazy mages doing some fun stuff out there, and this can be pulled into a book about artificers. So it would have been nice to see some more of that. But Terry, was there a quote that stood out to you in this book that made you smile?
There is. One is the well-written or interesting quote, as I am fond of having. And this was talking about the interaction between Ariadne and Daedalus. And it says, at first telling this myth has a misogynistic air. Ariadne was the pupil of the true male genius who fell for a handsome face and probably died alone. However, many artificer scholars point out that of the pair, it was she who attained divinity. And I just thought that was well written. And then the most magey quote in this is the definition section for chapter 5, and it says, a number of terms with specific meanings are used in this chapter. Yup. So we get a definition of definitions before we get the definitions. So yeah, there was also a bit on the Hagia Sophia. Legend says that the Emperor Justinian entered the completed building for the first time. He muttered, Solomon, I have surpassed thee, a claim of Christian victory over the Hermetic traditions, but also a uniquely proud boast on behalf of the Mason engineers who had done the work, or perhaps a slap in the face of their old ideals. It was well written. The words next to each other were done good, except for towards the end where you just got sentences that didn't have subjects anymore. But that kind of happens sometimes. So what are we reading next, Adam?
Next up is the Sorcerer's Crusade Companion, a 200-page book with more in general of stuff for Sorcerer's Crusade. As well as I can determine, there's no particular topic. It's just here's a lot of things for Sorcerer's Crusade.
Densely packed prose. A few things will get us out of the bed early in the morning. Quite like that. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, if you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with your questions, comments, or feedback. You can subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and other aggregators. If you like the show, others might like it too. And if you leave a review for Mage the Podcast, it makes us more visible in other people's searches. We would certainly appreciate that. You can follow us on Twitter at Mage the Podcast. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com. You can listen to past episodes there, see the order in which we compile them, and read the complete show notes that are prepared for you. We have a YouTube channel now where you can find our episodes. There's a link in the show notes, but you can also search YouTube for Mage the Podcast. All lowercase, don't sweat the colon, you'll find us. This episode was assisted greatly by our executive producers. Jerry, can you share the names of our executive producers?
I would be glad to. I would like to thank Oracle Buck Gregory, Oracle Christopher Phillips, Oracle Josh Hillerup, Oracle McHale, Oracle the Crow of Erebus, and Oracle Jay Widener. Additionally, I'd like to thank Alex, Alexia, Anders S., Andrew Edelstein, Anand, Badurfi, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Blake Ryan, Boo, Boogers to the Six, Brad of the Blue, Bryce Perry, Chris, Daniel Cubbin, Daniel Scrimier, Dan Svensson, David Roy, Derek Osborne, Derek Semsick, Fraggerrock, Dennis Osborne, George Lorick, Conan Stewart, Ia Bull, Jason Kennedy, Jason Vines, Jason W. Briggs, Jeff Bryn, John Magnuson, Joe Lynn Andes, Joshua Heath, Kathleen Halperin, Chris Kinner, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Poyle, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Morgan Iran, Nathan Weaver, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klamenov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Puka G, Rachel Grace, Ralph Scheinhammer, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Stephen Gallagher, Stephen Carton, Sean Gallagher, Thrice Great, William Conley, William Martin, and Zach Rules.
Well, if you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep producing episodes like this one. You would also become a part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link in the show notes will get you started. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and until next time, truth until paradox, baby.
Remember, you may suddenly be called upon to cut a diamond to kill a sendling in your journey to become a master silversmith, and until that day happens, go change reality. Bye. Outtakes. I don't know how scrolling works. I'm bad at computers. If anyone had seen the video, it would just be me going, bah, 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 bah.
Okay, we're supposed to do this sober? That changes everything.
I did start the day with a sun-kissed orange zero, and these things, I could get wired on it. 27 milligrams of caffeine. That's almost as much as a teaspoon of coffee, okay? I'm just wired.